He had nothing. She had everything. And the night a storm forced them under the same roof, neither of them could have predicted what it would cost them, or what it would build. A single father working 3 jobs to keep his daughter fed. A CEO hiding who she really was. One door opened in the rain, one conversation that lasted until morning, and a choice that would unravel both their lives before it gave them something neither had dared to want. This is the story of what happens when ordinary courage meets extraordinary power, and neither one survives the collision unchanged. If this story moves you, hit like and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The rain came down the way it sometimes does in Austin in late October. Not gradually, not with any warning, just all at once, like the sky had been holding something back for months and finally gave up trying. By 7:30 that evening, the streets near South Lamar were moving water, and the gutters along Ryan Carter's block had turned into shallow rivers carrying fast food wrappers and dead leaves toward the storm drains. Ryan noticed none of it. He was sitting at the kitchen table in his apartment on the second floor of a building that had seen better decades, going through a stack of bills with the focused misery of a man who already knew what the numbers were going to say. The table was a folding card table he'd bought at a garage sale 3 years ago. 2 of the legs were slightly uneven, so everything on it tilted faintly to the left. He'd gotten used to it. He'd gotten used to a lot of things. The electric bill was $43 higher than last month. He stared at it for a moment, then set it face down on the table like not looking at it would change what it said. Sophie was in the bedroom, the only real bedroom in the apartment. Ryan slept on a pull-out couch that left a bar pressing into his lower back every night, and he'd told himself for 8 months that he was going to buy a proper mattress as soon as things evened out. Things had not evened out. He could hear Sophie through the thin wall, doing that thing she did when she was supposed to be asleep but wasn't, narrating some elaborate story to her stuffed animals, her voice pitched low like she thought he couldn't hear. She was 7 years old and had inherited her mother's gift for storytelling and her grandfather's complete inability to go to sleep at a reasonable hour. Ryan rubbed his eyes with both hands and tried to think about the math. He worked the early shift at a warehouse on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, up at 4:30, back by 1. 3 afternoons a week he drove for a delivery service, which paid decently when the app had enough orders and barely covered gas when it didn't. On weekends when he had Sophie, which was most weekends since her mother had moved to Dallas 2 years ago with someone she'd met at a work conference, he picked up handyman work through a neighborhood app. Minor repairs, furniture assembly, one time a whole fence replacement that had taken 3 weekends and paid enough to cover Sophie's school supplies for the year. It was not a sustainable life. He understood that. But sustainable had always felt like a problem for future Ryan to solve, and future Ryan kept getting pushed further down the calendar. His phone buzzed. He picked it up without much enthusiasm. It was Marcus Webb, his oldest friend, a man who had known Ryan since they were both 14 years old, getting kicked out of the same after-school program for reasons neither of them had fully agreed with. "Hey, small favor. Friend of mine got stranded in your neighborhood. Her Uber canceled, cab won't come out in this rain, she can't reach anyone. Can she wait it out at yours? She's good people, I promise." Ryan read the message twice. He looked at the stack of bills. He looked at the window where the rain was hitting the glass hard enough to make a sound like gravel. He typed back, "How long?" Marcus. "Hour. Maybe 2. She's got somewhere to be later, just needs to wait for the storm to break." Ryan looked at the apartment. There was a basket of unfolded laundry on the couch, 3 of Sophie's drawings spread across the coffee table, and a sink with 2 dishes in it that he hadn't gotten to yet. He thought about saying no. He genuinely considered it. Then he thought about someone standing outside in this rain trying to get a cab that wasn't coming. "Fine," he typed. "Send me her number." She knocked 7 minutes later. Ryan opened the door and found a woman standing on his landing in a soaked trench coat, holding a bag that probably cost more than his monthly rent over one shoulder, with a strand of dark hair plastered flat across her forehead. She was not what he'd expected, though he hadn't quite formed an expectation. She was around his age, maybe a year or 2 younger, with the kind of face that was controlled even when it was wet and inconvenienced. Sharp jaw, steady eyes, a mouth that seemed to be deciding whether or not to apologize for the intrusion. She didn't apologize. "Ryan Carter," she said. "Yeah." "Victoria Bennett, Marcus said you were willing to let me wait out the storm." She paused. "I want you to know I tried 4 other options first." He almost laughed. "Good to know I was the last resort. Come in." She stepped inside and looked around the apartment the way people do when they're trying not to look like they're looking around. He caught it, the slight adjustment in her expression, the careful neutrality she pulled over her face when she registered the folding table and the laundry and the crayon drawings taped to the wall by the kitchen. He'd seen that look before from people who'd grown up with more than he had. He just hadn't expected to see it on someone standing in his doorway at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night. "Bathroom's down the hall if you want to dry off," he said. "I think I have a towel that's actually clean." "Thank you." She disappeared for a few minutes. Ryan moved the laundry basket off the couch and set it in the corner, then stood there for a moment trying to decide if he should offer her something to drink and what he actually had to offer. Coffee, definitely. He had coffee. A half-empty bottle of orange juice. Some sparkling water Sophie had declared she hated after he'd bought a 12-pack of it. Victoria came back with her hair combed out and the trench coat folded over her arm. She was wearing a dark blouse that had been expensive before the rain got to it, and slacks that still held their line despite everything. She sat on the edge of the couch like a person who was not entirely comfortable being a guest somewhere, which Ryan found oddly relatable. "Coffee?" he offered. "Please." He went to the kitchen. He could hear her behind him, not talking, not pulling out her phone, just sitting. Most people who were uncomfortable in silence reached for their phones. She didn't, which he noticed. "You know Marcus from where?" he asked, just to fill the air while the coffee maker grumbled through its process. "Business school," she said. "A long time ago. We haven't stayed especially close, but he has a good instinct for who to trust." She paused. "He said you're a decent person. That's a specific thing to say about someone." "Marcus has low standards for decency." "I don't think that's true." Ryan looked back at her over his shoulder. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. Not flirtatious, not particularly warm, just present in a way that felt unusual, like she was actually paying attention. "Black okay?" he asked. "Perfect." He brought 2 mugs over and sat in the armchair across from her. The rain was louder now, drumming hard on the roof. The apartment felt smaller with someone else in it, but not uncomfortably so. "You live here alone?" she asked. "With my daughter. She's 7. She's supposed to be asleep." "Supposed to be?" "She's currently telling a very involved story to a stuffed penguin named Carlos." For the first time, something shifted in Victoria's face. Not quite a smile, but close. A softening. "Carlos is a good name for a penguin." "She thinks so. I think he's seen some things." The conversation moved the way conversations sometimes do when 2 people have no particular stake in impressing each other, without strategy, without performance. Victoria asked about the neighborhood, and Ryan told her about it honestly. The Good Thai place 2 blocks over. The way the traffic on South Lamar could make parking a personal crisis. The fact that the building's management company had been promising to fix the heating system for 2 winters running. She listened more than she talked, which Ryan noticed. Most people in a strange place with a stranger defaulted to talking about themselves. She asked questions instead, and they weren't the polished questions of someone making cocktail party conversation. They were direct. "What do you do?" "How long have you been in Austin? What were you doing before the warehouse?" He told her about the warehouse, about the delivery driving, about the handyman work. He said it plainly, without the apologetic hedging he sometimes caught himself doing when the subject came up with people from his ex-wife's world. Victoria didn't offer the polite discomfort those people sometimes gave him, the subtle signals that they didn't know what to do with a man who worked 3 jobs and lived in a second-floor apartment with uneven furniture. She just listened, and at one point she said, "You're good at solving problems." "I haven't solved very many," he said honestly. "You solve them every day. You just don't call it that." She turned her mug in her hands. "Most people in your situation make excuses or make plans that never happen. You've built systems, 3 income sources, arranged around your daughter's schedule, with enough flexibility to handle emergencies. That's not a default setting. That's deliberate design." Ryan looked at her for a moment. "You talk like a consultant." She looked at him like she was deciding something, then said, I run a technology company. What kind? Infrastructure software. Systems that cities and logistics networks use to keep things running. Water management, traffic routing, supply chain coordination. She said it without ceremony. We're about 3 years old and we're growing faster than we should, which means we're constantly fixing problems we didn't anticipate. What kind of problems? And then something changed in the conversation. Not dramatically, not with any clear turning point, but gradually, the way a tide moves. Victoria started talking about her company. Not the polished elevator pitch version, the actual version. The things that kept her up at night. A legacy code base one of her senior engineers had built that only 3 people in the company truly understood. A client in Phoenix that was using their system in ways it hadn't been designed for. And the fact that it was working somehow, which was almost more troubling than if it had failed. A board that pushed for aggressive expansion while the operational foundation beneath the company still had gaps. Ryan leaned forward in his armchair and started asking questions. Not polite questions. Real ones. He didn't know the technical vocabulary, but he understood systems the way you understand them when you've spent years keeping things running on not enough. When you've had to figure out why the washing machine at the laundromat on 5th was cycling shorter than it should, why the restaurant where he'd worked at 22 kept running out of a specific supply, even though the delivery schedule looked fine on paper, why his delivery route on Tuesday evenings took him 12 minutes longer than the app predicted, and what the actual pattern was behind that. He thought out loud, and Victoria listened with the same quality of attention she'd given everything else. At some point, she set down her coffee mug and just watched him talk. The Phoenix thing, he said. If the system's working in a way it wasn't designed for, the question isn't whether to stop them. It's why it's working. Because if you understand that, you found a use case your engineers didn't predict, and that's either your next feature or your next security hole. Victoria was quiet for a moment. My CTO said something similar, in different words. Your CTO's probably right. She's usually right. That's why I pay her more than I pay most of my board. The sound of the rain had changed, not stopped, but settled into a lower register. The hammering eased into something steadier. Ryan checked the clock on the microwave and found that an hour and 40 minutes had passed without either of them tracking it. Daddy? They both turned. Sophie was standing in the hallway in her pajamas, the ones with the small dinosaurs on them, holding Carlos the penguin by one flipper and looking at Victoria with the specific alert curiosity of a 7-year-old encountering an unknown variable. Hey, Bug, Ryan said. You're supposed to be asleep. I heard talking. She shifted her attention between the two of them, settled on Victoria. Who are you? Sophie, Ryan said. Victoria leaned forward slightly. I'm Victoria. I got caught in the rain and your dad let me wait inside. I hope that's okay. Sophie considered this seriously. You're wet. I was. I dried off. Carlos doesn't like rain either. He's from Antarctica, so you'd think he would, but he doesn't. Victoria's expression did something complicated. That's a good point. Did he tell you that? He tells me a lot of things. Sophie moved into the room with the easy confidence of a child who'd never been made to feel unwelcome in her own home, and climbed up onto the couch beside Victoria without asking permission. Ryan watched this, slightly mortified. Sophie looked at Victoria's bag. Is that real leather? Sophie. It's a fair question, Victoria said. She glanced at Ryan once, then back at Sophie. It is. How do you know it's real? Because it cost a lot of money, and I made the mistake of buying it anyway. Sophie thought about this. Daddy says things that cost a lot of money aren't always worth it. Your dad is usually right about that. Sophie seemed satisfied with this answer in a way that slightly surprised Ryan. His daughter had a finely tuned instrument for adults who were patronizing her, and she did not deploy it now. She leaned against the armrest and looked at Victoria with frank interest. Do you know Marcus? Ryan asked after a moment. She does, Victoria said. Business school. Marcus came to my birthday, Sophie reported. He brought me a book about volcanoes. Did you like it? I liked the pictures. Some of the words were too long. She paused. Daddy explained the long ones. Ryan stood up. Okay, you, back to bed. I'm not tired. You're telling stories to a penguin at 9 o'clock on a school night. Come on. Sophie looked at Victoria. Will you be here in the morning? No, Victoria said. I have to go soon. Sophie seemed to weigh this, then held Carlos out toward Victoria in what Ryan recognized as a significant gesture. Sophie did not offer Carlos to many people. You can hold him for a minute if you want. He's good with strangers. Victoria took the penguin carefully, with both hands, as if she understood the weight of what had been extended. She held him for a moment, and something moved through her face that Ryan couldn't name. Thank you, Carlos, she said. Sophie retrieved him, apparently satisfied, and allowed herself to be steered back toward the bedroom. Ryan tucked her in, listened to 30 seconds of a half-remembered argument about whether she could keep the light on, lost the argument, and came back to find Victoria standing by the window with her coat over her arm, looking at the street. The rain had stopped. I should go, she said. I've taken up enough of your evening. It wasn't a problem. He meant it. She picked up her bag and they stood in the small entryway between the door and the kitchen in that slightly awkward geography of a goodbye with someone you've just met. Ryan expected a handshake, maybe a polite thank you, the kind of exit that closed the door on the conversation completely. Instead, she looked at him, that direct, evaluating look she'd had since the beginning, and said, the way you think, about systems, about why things work or don't work. She paused. It's not common. I fix broken things for a living, he said. I know, that's what I mean. She adjusted the strap of her bag. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do with that observation, but I wanted you to know I made it. He wasn't sure what to say to that, so he said nothing, which apparently was fine. Thank you for the coffee, she said, and for the shelter. Tell Sophie that Carlos made a good impression. She left. Ryan stood in the open doorway for a moment, listening to her footsteps on the stairs. The wet street below caught the streetlight and threw it back in pieces. He stayed there longer than he needed to. 3 weeks passed. The warehouse, the deliveries, the uneven table with the bills. Sophie's school called once about a potential reading group she might benefit from, and Ryan spent 40 minutes after Sophie went to bed researching whether it cost anything and how he could arrange his schedule to handle the different pickup time. He researched it the way he researched everything. Systematically, without drama, trying to find the version of the solution that worked. He didn't think about Victoria Bennett much, or he tried not to. The evening had been what it was, a strange interlude, a conversation that had moved faster and deeper than most of the conversations he had in a given month, with a person who had been passing through and was now gone. He'd looked her up once, the morning after, because he was human. CEO, Bennett Technologies. He'd found a few profile pieces in business publications, a TED Talk he hadn't watched, a photograph from a conference where she looked exactly the way she'd looked in his apartment except dry and in better lighting. The company was doing well by every external metric. She'd built it from Series A to a significant player in infrastructure software in under 4 years, which the articles treated as extraordinary. He'd closed the browser tab and not gone back. Then she called. It was a Thursday morning, 10:15, which meant he was between the warehouse shift and the afternoon deliveries, sitting in a parking lot eating a sandwich he'd made that morning and listening to a sports podcast to give his brain something to do. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Ryan Carter, he said. It's Victoria Bennett. No preamble? No, do you remember me? She knew he remembered her. I have a proposition, not a small one. I'd like to meet and talk through it properly before you make any decisions. He looked at his sandwich. What kind of proposition? A job, senior level, with real compensation. She paused. I'm not going to pretend the offer doesn't come partly from that conversation we had, but I want to be clear that it's also based on a specific problem I'm trying to solve and a gap I have in my leadership team that I think you can fill. Silence. The podcast was still playing in his earbuds. He pulled them out. Victoria, he said slowly, I don't have a college degree. I don't have corporate experience. I know your background. I looked. Another pause. I've also watched 2 of my senior executives with MBAs from good schools completely fail to identify a supply chain integration issue that's been bleeding the company for 7 months. You found 3 separate problems in my operational model in under 2 hours in your kitchen, 2 of which I hadn't consciously articulated yet. Ryan pressed the back of his head against the headrest. I'm not charity, she continued, and her voice was even, matter of fact. I don't do charity. If I thought you were going to fail at this, I wouldn't be making the call. I'm making the call because I think you're going to be very good at a very specific thing, and I need that thing badly enough that I'm willing to take the unconventional route to get it. He thought about the bills on the tilting table. He thought about Sophie's reading group. He thought about the heating system that was going to fail again in February because the management company was never going to fix it. What does senior level mean, he said, in numbers? She told him. Ryan sat very still in the parking lot for a moment. That's... He stopped. A substantial change from your current situation, she finished. Yes. He looked out the windshield at the parking lot, the gray November sky, the fast food cup rolling slowly across the asphalt in a slight wind. When do you want to meet? He said. They met 2 days later at a coffee shop near the Bennett Technologies office. Not in her office, which he appreciated. She'd brought one document, a 2-page summary of the role and its scope, and she slid it across the table when they sat down. He read it carefully while she drank her coffee and didn't rush him. Director of Operational Strategy, reporting directly to the CEO, responsible for identifying and resolving systemic inefficiencies in the company's infrastructure, both technical and organizational, a scope that was, on its face, enormous and somewhat loosely defined. This is real? He said. I don't write fictional job descriptions. It's a big title for someone who's never worked in an office. Most people who have worked in offices have learned to navigate offices. That's not the same as being good at solving operational problems. She turned her coffee cup. I've watched people with impressive credentials completely fail to see past how things are supposed to work to how they actually work. You see the actual version. That's the job. Ryan set the paper down. The people on your team who've been there longer, the ones with the degrees and the experience, they're going to have thoughts about this. Yes, she said simply. That doesn't bother you? It's a management challenge. It's not unfamiliar territory. He looked at her. It should bother you a little. Those are real people with real grievances. She held his look. You're right. It should, and it does. I'm telling you it won't stop me from making the decision I think is right. She paused. But I want you to know what you're walking into. You won't walk in with existing respect. You'll have to earn it, and some people will make that harder than it needs to be. I'm aware of that dynamic, he said. I know you are. They sat with that for a moment. Can I start on the 23rd? He asked. Sophie has a school thing on the 22nd, and I'm the only parent who can take her. Victoria looked at him with that expression he was starting to recognize, the one that wasn't quite a smile but held something that might become one. The 23rd is fine. He nodded once. Then he looked down at the paper again, at the number in the compensation section. He allowed himself privately 1 full second of thinking about what this number meant, what it changed, what it made possible. Then he folded the paper twice and put it in his jacket pocket. I'll need to arrange childcare for early mornings, he said, and there will be a week in January when Sophie's school has a different schedule. I want to be upfront about that. Noted, Victoria said. I'll be good at this job, he said. It wasn't a boast. It was information. I know, she said. It wasn't reassurance. It was an answer. Outside, the November afternoon was cold but clear, nothing like the storm that had started all of this. Ryan walked back to his car thinking about Sophie and about the tilting table and about what it meant to take a chance when you had someone else counting on you and no safety net beneath you if you got it wrong. He thought about Victoria saying, you see the actual version. He'd spent years seeing the actual version of things, seeing which systems were held together with goodwill and improvisation, seeing where the stories people told about how things worked diverged from the reality of how they worked. He'd never thought of it as a skill worth paying for. He pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward school pickup because Sophie got out at 3:15 and the route on Tuesdays backed up near the intersection of South Congress if you didn't leave by 2:45, and he knew that because he'd tracked it over 6 weeks and mapped the pattern. He did that kind of thing without thinking. Maybe that had always been worth something. Maybe now he was going to find out. That's it. The night before his first day, Ryan sat at the card table after Sophie had gone to sleep and stared at nothing in particular for a long time. He told Sophie about the new job carefully, in language she could use. A big company, an important job. More money, which means some things that have been hard won't be as hard. She'd asked if he still had to do the deliveries, and he'd said no, not anymore. And she'd been quiet for a moment and then said she'd liked when he brought home the leftover delivery bags sometimes. "I'll still bring you stuff," he'd said, "just not because I'm getting paid to drive it." She'd accepted this. She was a practical person, his daughter. She'd gotten that from him. He looked at the bills on the table. He looked at the laundry basket in the corner. He looked at the window and the streetlight outside and the way the light sat on the wet pavement from the earlier drizzle. He thought about a woman in a soaked trench coat standing on his landing saying, "I tried 4 other options first." No apology, no softening, just the plain truth of the situation. He thought he might understand her a little. The impulse to say things straight, the discomfort with anything that wasn't the actual version. He gathered the bills into a neat stack and set them inside a folder he'd bought at the dollar store. He folded the laundry because it needed doing and because he couldn't sleep anyway. He checked on Sophie once, finding her exactly as he'd left her, Carlos the penguin tucked under one arm with the decisive grip of someone who knew what mattered. He set his alarm for 6, and sometime between midnight and the alarm, in the city that had been grinding him down and holding him up simultaneously for 6 years, Ryan Carter finally slept. The Bennett Technologies office occupied the top 2 floors of a glass building off East 6th, the kind of building that had gone up in the last decade as Austin transformed itself into something its older residents sometimes didn't recognize. The lobby had exposed concrete and a living wall of plants and the quiet, confident hum of a company that knew it was doing well and had chosen an aesthetic to match. Ryan walked in at 8:45 on his first morning wearing the best clothes he owned. Dark slacks, a button-down he'd ironed twice because the first time hadn't been good enough. Carrying a leather notebook he'd bought at a drugstore the night before because he'd felt like he needed something to carry, and his phone seemed insufficient. The receptionist smiled at him with the professional warmth of someone who smiled at everyone this way. He told her his name. She made a call. He stood by the living wall and looked at the plants and tried not to look like someone who was calculating whether he'd made a catastrophic mistake. He had made this feeling before. The first day at the warehouse 6 years ago. The first time he'd taken a handyman job and arrived at someone's house with tools he'd mostly figured out from YouTube. The first time he'd left Sophie with a babysitter for an 8-hour shift and spent 4 of those hours mentally checking whether the babysitter had her emergency number right. The feeling was not comfortable. He'd learned to work through it anyway. Victoria came down herself, which he hadn't expected. She was in a charcoal blazer and had her hair pulled back, and she looked entirely at home in a way that reminded him clearly that this was her building, her company, her world, and that he was the guest now, which was an inversion from the night they'd met that didn't escape him. "Morning," she said. No excessive warmth, no performance. "How was the drive?" "Fine. Parked 2 blocks over." "We have a parking validation. I'll have someone send you the info." She moved toward the elevator and he followed. "Today is orientation and introductions. I'm going to ask you to spend the first 2 weeks mostly observing before you start making recommendations." "Understood." "Not because I think you need to be slow about it, because if you come in making recommendations before people have any reason to trust your judgment, they'll dismiss them on principle." She glanced at him as the elevator opened. "The recommendations themselves will be better received after you've established some presence." "That's good advice," he said. "It's obvious advice. I've been running this company for 3 years." They rode up in silence for a moment. "You look nervous," she said. "I'm not nervous." She looked at him sideways. "You've been gripping that notebook since the lobby." Ryan looked down at his hand. He loosened his grip. "I'm fine." "I know you are," she said. "I'm just pointing it out." Well, the team leads met him in a conference room that looked out over the city. 6 people, arranged around a long table with the specific energy of people who had been briefed but hadn't been consulted. Ryan recognized the dynamic immediately. It was the energy of people who were deciding, without saying so, how much resistance was appropriate. Victoria introduced him without ceremony. Director of Operational Strategy, reporting directly to her, tasked with identifying systemic inefficiencies and developing solutions. That was it. No biography, no explanation of how she'd found him, no attempt to sell the room on the decision she'd already made. He appreciated the honesty of it, even as he registered the wall it built. There was a woman named Dana Reyes, VP of Engineering, who looked at Ryan the way you look at a weather forecast you already know is wrong. She was somewhere in her late 30s, had a dry manner, and a very direct way of making eye contact that said clearly, "I have opinions about this, and I will not be sharing all of them right now." Ryan made a note of her, not with suspicion, just as information. She was competent. You could tell that from the way she sat. There was a man named Phil Garrett, Chief Revenue Officer, who was gregarious in the specific way of people who use gregariousness to avoid being pinned down. He shook Ryan's hand hard and said, "Welcome aboard," with the enthusiasm of someone who'd practiced saying welcome aboard. Ryan filed him differently than Dana. The others introduced themselves, and Ryan tried to pay attention to what wasn't being said alongside what was. The slight pause before someone said, "Good to meet you." The way one of the junior team leads glanced at Dana after Victoria left the room. The absence of anyone asking him a single question about his background or his ideas. He was the unknown variable. They were waiting to see what he broke. He understood the assignment. For 2 weeks he watched, and he asked questions that he framed as questions and not challenges. And he ate lunch in the common area instead of at his desk, so that people who wanted to talk to him had a low-stakes way to do it. He walked the floors, sat in on calls when he was invited to, learned the org chart not from the document version, but from the version you built by watching who deferred to whom in a room and who got interrupted and who went quiet when certain topics came up. He called Sophie every night at 7:30. She told him about her reading group, about a conflict with a girl in her class named Brianna that had unfolded across a full week of complicated 7-year-old social dynamics, about the volcano book Marcus had given her. She'd made it further into the long words. He told her about the office plants and the conference room, and once about a very bad cup of coffee from the machine on the 3rd floor, which she found extremely funny for reasons he didn't fully understand. He didn't tell her about the harder parts, about Dana Reyes asking him in a meeting, with careful neutrality, what his background in systems architecture was, a question that was fair on the surface and pointed underneath. About the time he'd offered an observation in a strategy meeting and one of Phil's deputies had said, "That's an interesting take," in the tone that meant the exact opposite. About the specific loneliness of eating lunch in a building full of people who were still deciding whether to let you in. He worked through it the way he worked through everything, methodically, without drama. He found the first problem in his 9th day. It wasn't one of the company's visible discussed problems. Not the Phoenix client issue or the legacy codebase or any of the things Victoria had mentioned in his kitchen. It was something smaller. A report that 3 different teams generated separately, each with slightly different parameters, each informing decisions in slightly different ways, such that the decisions made by the engineering team and the revenue team about the same project were sometimes based on subtly different underlying data. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was the kind of hairline fracture that, under stress, became something worse. He spent 2 evenings mapping it out, checking whether he'd understood it correctly, then wrote a 2-page summary of what he'd found, what it was causing, and what a fix would look like. He sent it to Victoria on a Thursday night with a note that said, "First observation. Let me know if the framing is wrong before I take this to anyone else." She responded at 11:20 p.m. "Well, framing is right. The problem's been there longer than 9 days. Take it to Dana first. This is her territory, and she should hear it from you before a meeting." He stared at the message for a moment. Then he typed, "Tomorrow morning?" "Tomorrow morning," she wrote back. Dana Reyes had an office that was organized with the same quality of controlled order Ryan had noticed in the way she sat. Nothing performative about it, just efficient. She looked up when he appeared in her doorway, and her expression was the same careful neutrality she'd been deploying since his first day. "You have a minute?" he asked. "I have 4 minutes. What is it?" He came in and sat across from her and put the 2-page document on her desk without preamble. She looked at it, then at him, then picked it up and read. He watched her read it. She was fast. She moved through the first page with the focused speed of someone who'd been processing technical documents for years and slowed on the second, where the data was. She set it down. "How'd you find this?" she said. cross-referencing the Q3 reports from the three teams on the Meridian project. The variance in base parameters was small enough that it probably looked like formatting differences. It did look like formatting differences. She said this flatly, without defensiveness, which Ryan respected. For about 14 months. The decision divergence on the Meridian timeline in August, the push-pull between engineering and revenue on the rollout schedule, was partly this, she finished. She pressed her lips together and looked at the document again. Not entirely, but it didn't help. She looked up. What's your proposed fix? Centralized reporting template with a shared data source. Designated owner for the master parameters on each project. Review checkpoint before any major decision to confirm all teams are drawing from the same version. He shrugged slightly. It's not technical, it's operational, which is why it probably lived in the cracks between teams for so long. Dana looked at him for a long moment with an expression he couldn't fully decode. It wasn't warmth exactly. It wasn't the neutrality she'd been maintaining either. It was something closer to recalibration. I'll take this to my team, she said. I want to validate the fix before we present it upward. That's the right call, he said. It's your area. She picked up the document. Did you show this to Victoria first? I sent her the summary last night. She told me to bring it to you before any meeting. Something shifted slightly in Dana's expression at that. Not dramatically, just a small adjustment. Like a small thing she'd been expecting hadn't materialized. I'll be in touch, she said. He stood up. He was almost to the door when she said, Carter. He turned. The Meridian timeline conflict cost us 6 weeks and a significant client relationship strain. She said it without editorializing. If you'd found this in August, that doesn't happen. I wasn't here in August. No, she said. You weren't. He left her office and walked back to his own space with the careful pace of someone who wasn't letting himself feel how much that had mattered to hear. The fix rolled out over 3 weeks. Dana ran it through her team, proposed some refinements that Ryan incorporated, and they presented it jointly in a leadership meeting that Phil Garrett chaired because Victoria was traveling. Phil received it with his professional enthusiasm, which meant nothing. But 2 of the other team leads asked real questions, technical questions, the kind that meant they'd engaged with the material seriously. It was not a triumph. It was a plumbing repair. Unglamorous, necessary, immediately useful. But people noticed when the report stopped diverging and the Meridian project team sent a message to Dana saying the coordination was already cleaner. Dana forwarded it to Ryan without comment. Just the forwarded message. He read it twice, then saved it in a folder he'd made on his desktop that he labeled, with deliberate minimalism, evidence. Other things happened in those weeks that were harder. A staff meeting where he offered a perspective on client onboarding, and a senior manager named Cole, Phil's man, young and well-dressed and not quite hiding how much he disliked Ryan's presence, cut across him mid-sentence to redirect the conversation. Not aggressively, just cleanly, the way you cut across someone when you've decided their contribution doesn't require acknowledgement. Ryan had finished his sentence anyway, and the meeting had moved on, and afterward he'd sat at his desk for a few minutes, not thinking about it. He'd been cut off before. He'd learned long ago that the people who cut you off in a room were usually more worried about you than the people who engaged with you. He just didn't love it. There was also the question of what people said when he wasn't in the room, which he couldn't hear directly but could track indirectly. He caught it once. A conversation that stopped slightly too quickly when he came around a corner near the printer bay, the specific recalibration of people who'd been saying something they weren't going to keep saying. He didn't know the specifics. He could construct the general shape. New guy, no degree. Victoria's hire. How long before the performance reviews tell the real story? He thought about it for approximately 45 minutes total, spread across 3 days. Then he put it back in the category of things he couldn't control and focused on the things he could. It was in his 5th week that he found the bigger one. The company had a logistics platform, one of their core products, that 3 major clients were using for supply chain coordination. The platform had been built in a hurry during the company's rapid growth period, layered over older architecture, and it worked. It mostly worked. But Ryan had been watching the client support tickets quietly, reading through them in the evenings after Sophie was asleep, and he'd noticed a pattern. Under certain traffic conditions, specifically when two or more of the platform's high-volume clients ran major operations simultaneously. The system's load balancing showed a roughly 12% inefficiency in processing allocation. It didn't cause failures. Not yet. But the company was growing, the client base was expanding, and the conditions under which that 12% became a problem were conditions that were going to occur more and more frequently. He wrote it up carefully over 4 evenings. He modeled out 3 scenarios showing when the current architecture would start generating real failure risk. He proposed 2 possible remediation paths, with rough cost and timeline estimates drawn from conversations he'd had with the engineering team on other topics. Conversations he'd had deliberately, specifically to understand the technical landscape without tipping his hand. Then he sat with it for 2 more days, checking his logic, because the last thing he could afford was to bring a flawed analysis to a technical team that was already watching for his mistakes. He was going over the numbers one more time at his desk on a Tuesday afternoon when Victoria appeared in his doorway. She did that sometimes. She didn't always call ahead, just appeared. He'd learned she moved around the company this way without announcement, which he understood. If you always announced yourself, you only saw the version of your company people wanted to show you. She looked at his screen. What is it? He turned the monitor slightly toward her. Load balancing issue in the logistics platform. Latent risk, not current failure. But we're going to need to address it. She pulled a chair over without asking and sat beside him, and for 20 minutes they went through it together, her asking sharp, technical questions that surprised him until he remembered she'd built this company from the ground up and understood the architecture at depth, him walking her through the analysis and the remediation options. When they were done, she leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. How long have you been working on this? She said. Off and on, about 3 weeks. Why didn't you bring it to me sooner? I wanted to be sure, he said. I don't have a technical background. I needed to run the numbers enough times that I trusted them before I put them in front of someone who does. She looked at him. The afternoon light from his window was at an angle that made the office feel less like an office, more like a room where people just talked. Do you trust them now? She said. Yes. Then let's get Dana. She called Dana Reyes to Ryan's office, and the 3 of them spent another hour going through the analysis. Dana pushed back on parts of it. Her pushback was technical and specific and fair, and twice she found places where Ryan's modeling had been imprecise, and he acknowledged it, and they revised it together. At the end of it, Dana sat back and said, in the level tone she used for everything, the core finding is right. The timeline is probably more compressed than this shows. We need to start remediation planning this quarter. Victoria looked at Ryan. He looked at the revised model on his screen. Good work, Dana said. She said it the way a person says something they mean and don't particularly feel the need to elaborate on. Ryan nodded once. After they'd both gone, he sat in the quiet of his office for a long time, not celebrating, not processing in any dramatic way, just breathing. The city outside his window was doing its late afternoon thing, the light changing, the traffic building, the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday grinding forward. He thought about the tilting table, about the stack of bills, about Sophie and the volcano book, and Carlos the penguin, and what it had taken to get from that kitchen to this window. He didn't let himself stay there long. There was still work to do, and the evenings were shorter now, and Sophie had a school project due that she needed help with. But for a moment, just a moment, he let it be what it was. Nam. The problem was that as his value inside the company became harder to dismiss, the conversation outside changed shape. He didn't notice it all at once. It came in fragments. A comment someone made to Marcus, secondhand, about Ryan's relationship with Victoria. An article in a local business blog, minor, not widely read, that mentioned Bennett Technologies' unorthodox hiring practices, and wondered aloud whether a certain recently appointed director had earned his position through merit or proximity to the CEO. Phil Garrett mentioned it to him once, framed as friendly warning. They were in the elevator and Phil said, with his smile at full wattage, "Heads up, people are paying attention to you and Victoria. I'm just saying, keep things professional and you're fine." A pause. "I'm sure you're already doing that." Ryan looked at him for a moment. "Thanks, Phil." The elevator opened. Phil got out. Ryan stood in it a second longer than necessary, then got out too and went back to his desk and did not throw anything or say anything to anyone, which he considered a significant personal achievement. The insinuation itself was not complicated. He'd come from nowhere. Victoria had hired him. They spent time together, professionally, in the way that a director and a CEO spend time together when one is tasked with solving operational problems for the other. The external logic of a rumor was not difficult to build from those materials. What the rumor got wrong was the actual nature of what had developed between them, which was more complicated and less clean than the rumor's version. The truth was that Ryan had come to understand Victoria in layers, the way you understand someone you work near closely. The gap between the version she presented publicly and the version that existed in the room when a problem wasn't resolving and she'd been at it for 12 hours. She was harder to shake than most people, and more honest than was always comfortable, and occasionally wrong in ways she was slow to admit. She pushed the people around her, including him. Sometimes that felt like respect. Sometimes it felt like pressure. And there was the other thing, which he was not going to be careless about, which he'd recognized weeks ago and set aside because the setting aside was the right thing to do in a situation like this one. She'd asked him once, on a late evening when they were both still at the office and most of the floor had emptied out, "Do you regret it? Leaving everything you'd set up to come here?" He'd thought about it genuinely before answering. "Not yet." That's not a fully reassuring answer. "It's the honest one," he said. "Ask me again in 6 months." She'd looked at him with that expression he'd come to recognize, the one that meant she was filing something. "I'll remember to," she said. He believed her. The rumor and what was actually true between them were different things, but they occupied the same visible geography, and he understood that distinction didn't matter to people who'd already made up their minds. That was not something he could fix. The only thing he could control was the quality of his work and the consistency of his conduct, and he had a specific, focused, almost stubborn commitment to both. So he kept going. He came in early and stayed late when the work required it. He brought his findings to the right people in the right order and gave credit where credit was due, and didn't make enemies where he didn't have to. He called Sophie every night at 7:30. He ate lunch in the common area, and on a Friday in his 8th week, Dana Reyes stopped by his desk with 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him without asking whether he wanted it. "The remediation plan for the logistics platform went to the board this morning," she said. "They approved the budget." Ryan looked up from his screen. "Full remediation, not the partial fix," she said. "Your modeling made the case." She sat down in the chair across from him with her own cup. "For what it's worth, I told Victoria in December that the load balancing was going to be a problem eventually. She asked me to put it in writing, and I said I'd get to it." She looked at her coffee. "I didn't get to it." "You have a department to run," Ryan said. "I have a department to run," she agreed. "And you were looking at it from outside the department, which is why you saw it differently." They sat there for a moment in the comfortable silence of 2 people who understood each other well enough not to need more words around a point. "Cole is going to keep being a problem for you," she said then. "I figured. He's been with Phil for 4 years and he's good at what he does, and he's decided you're a threat to the way things are organized. I'm just telling you so you can see it clearly." "I can see it clearly." She nodded once, finished her coffee, and stood up. "Good work on the logistics problem," she said. "The next one you find, bring it to me first. We can present it together." She left. Ryan looked at the door she'd walked through, then at the coffee cup she'd put on his desk. He thought about trust and how it was built, not in moments, but in 100 small transactions that accrued over time, each one a decision to behave consistently, to be the same person in the room as you were in the hallway, to do what you said and say what you meant even when no one was checking. He'd been doing that his whole life. He just hadn't always had the right room to do it in. Outside, Austin was moving through a bright February afternoon, and in 3 hours he had to pick up Sophie, and after that she needed help with fractions, and the heating system in his apartment had finally, predictably, given out again. He had a list. He always had a list. He picked up his pen and added to it. The logistics platform remediation launched in March, and for 6 weeks it was the thing Ryan was most known for inside Bennett Technologies. In the specific, understated way that operational fixes get acknowledged in companies where the visible work is always sales and product and growth, And the invisible work is the scaffolding that keeps everything from collapsing. He didn't mind invisible. He'd spent most of his life doing work that no one framed a certificate for. What he minded slightly was that the success had made Cole Whitfield more careful rather than less hostile. And careful hostility was harder to read than the open kind. Cole had been Phil Garrett's deputy for 4 years, and he moved through the company with the ease of someone who understood its politics the way a local understands a neighborhood. Which alleys led where, which doors open for which people, how to make a thing happen or not happen without ever being the visible cause. Ryan had watched him long enough to understand the shape of it. He just didn't have enough confirmed data yet to know what Cole was actually willing to do. That question got answered in April. The Hartwell account was the company's largest client, a municipal infrastructure consortium covering water and traffic systems across 4 mid-sized Texas cities. Bennett Technologies had been managing their integration for 2 years, and the relationship was good, and the contract renewal in June was worth enough to the company's revenue picture that Phil Garrett had put it at the top of every monthly priorities list since January. Ryan had been brought into the Hartwell renewal process in March, initially in a support capacity, cross-checking the operational data that would inform the contract terms, making sure the performance metrics they were presenting to the client were accurate and that the underlying system was actually capable of the service levels they were promising for the next 2 years. He found a problem in the data. Not fraud, not fabrication, just a gap between what the automatic reporting pulled and what the actual performance record showed over 18 months when you ran a more granular analysis. The automatic system had been calculating uptime by averaging across all 4 cities equally. But one of the cities, Denton, had experienced a recurring latency issue during peak traffic periods that the average absorbed without surfacing. The service level agreement they were about to offer Hartwell included uptime guarantees that the Denton subsystem, in its current state, could not reliably meet. It was fixable. It would take 6 weeks and a targeted engineering sprint, and if they started immediately, they could have it resolved before the June renewal. But it needed to be disclosed to the Hartwell team, and it needed to be fixed, and the timeline on the renewal discussion needed to account for it. Ryan wrote it up and brought it to Phil. Phil read the summary with the expression of a man opening a bill he'd hoped not to receive. He set it down on his desk and looked at Ryan across the wide, clean surface. "How confident are you in this?" Phil said. "Confident enough to put my name on it." "The renewal is 8 weeks out." "I know, which is why I'm bringing it now instead of later." Phil was quiet for a moment. He picked up a pen and tapped it twice against his palm. Not an aggressive gesture, just the physical expression of thinking through a calculation. "If we disclose this to Hartwell, they're going to want concessions. Price adjustment, extended penalty clauses." "Probably," Ryan said. "Or they find out 6 months into the new contract when the Denton system fails during a peak period, and then we're having a different and worse conversation." Phil looked at him. "That's a risk assessment. I'm talking about the deal as it stands." "So am I," Ryan said. He left the document on Phil's desk. He walked back to his office and sat down and thought about the way Phil had looked at him. Not the way a man looks at a problem he's going to solve, but the way a man looks at a problem he's going to manage around. He mentioned it to Victoria that evening. They'd fallen into a pattern of brief check-ins, sometimes in person, sometimes by text, that had developed organically over his months at the company. Not scheduled, not formal. Just the natural communication of 2 people who were working closely on the same set of problems and had found each other's judgment useful. He told her about the Hartwell issue and about the conversation with Phil. She was quiet on the other end for a moment. "Did he say he was going to act on it?" "He didn't say he wasn't." "I'll follow up with him tomorrow," she said. "He's going to say the timeline is too tight for a disclosure conversation." "Probably," she said. "That doesn't make it the right call." She did follow up, and Phil did move on it. A modified disclosure, softer than Ryan had proposed, that acknowledged the Denton issue without framing it as a service-level risk. Hartwell's project manager asked 2 careful questions in a call that Ryan wasn't on, and the renewal conversation continued. It wasn't the clean handling Ryan would have chosen, but it was better than nothing, and the engineering sprint on the Denton subsystem was approved. He considered it a partial outcome and moved forward. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing in April, was that Cole had been in Phil's office the afternoon after Ryan's meeting, and that a conversation had happened there that Ryan would only understand the shape of later, when the damage was already done. Boss, the system failure hit on a Tuesday morning in May. Ryan was at his desk at 7:40, half an hour before most of the floor arrived, working through the week's priorities with a second cup of coffee and the specific focused quiet he'd come to rely on in those early hours. His phone screen lit up with a message from Dana. Call me. Now. He called. The Hartwell integration went down at 6:50, she said. All 4 cities, traffic routing, water management coordination, the full stack. It's been 40 minutes. Ryan set down his coffee. What's the failure mode? That's the problem. It doesn't match anything we've seen before. The system diagnostic is showing a cascading authentication failure across the integration nodes, but the trigger doesn't make sense. The nodes don't communicate that way under normal conditions. He was already up and moving toward the elevator. Who's on it? My whole team. I've got 6 engineers on it right now. They're not happy, Ryan. They've got city traffic systems running on manual override, and one of the water treatment coordination systems is running on local backup. Is the backup stable? For now. We've got a window before it becomes a safety issue, but it's not wide. He made it to the engineering floor in 4 minutes and spent the next 3 hours in the war room with Dana's team, going through the failure logs line by line. He wasn't the technical expert in the room. He was the one asking the questions that the technical experts were too close to the problem to think to ask. Why this cascade pattern and not a standard failover? Why did the authentication failure propagate in this direction rather than triggering the redundancy protocol? What changed in the system environment in the 48 hours before the failure? That last question produced the answer, eventually. A configuration update had been pushed to the integration layer the previous Sunday evening. A routine maintenance push, scheduled through the standard process, logged and approved. Except when Dana's lead engineer pulled the actual change log and compared it against the approved update, there was a discrepancy. The approved update was minor. What had actually been pushed included a secondary configuration change to the authentication token refresh cycle, a change that wasn't in the approved documentation and that, under the specific load conditions of a Tuesday morning peak period, had caused exactly the cascade they were looking at. It took until 11:30 to restore the Hartwell systems. City traffic and water coordination came back in stages, not all at once, which meant another hour and a half of manual management while the restoration propagated. Ryan sat in the war room after the engineers had moved into recovery mode and felt the specific exhaustion of a crisis that was over but not finished, because the system coming back online was only the first problem. The second problem was already waiting. It arrived in the form of a board emergency call at 2 p.m. Victoria ran it. She was controlled in the way she was always controlled under pressure, but Ryan had been around her enough months to read the finer signals. The slight tension in how she was sitting, the way she'd addressed the board members by last name rather than first. She was managing something. The board had questions, reasonable questions, most of them, delivered with the specific anxiety of people who were watching a major client relationship potentially unravel in real time. What happened? Why it happened? What the operational oversight failure was? Phil Garrett spoke twice. Both times he framed the issue around the operational oversight structure, which, he noted with careful regret, had been Ryan's domain. Ryan listened to this with the stillness of someone who understood exactly what was happening. After the call, Victoria came to find him. She came to his office and closed the door, which she almost never did, and stood rather than sitting. Phil's positioning this as a failure in your oversight process, she said. I know. He's going to the board with a formal statement. He's arguing that the configuration update fell within a review scope that you were responsible for implementing but hadn't fully operationalized yet. Ryan looked at her. The update was pushed through the standard engineering approval process. I've never been responsible for approving routine maintenance pushes. That's not in my scope, and it was never in my scope. I know that, she said. Does the board know that? She was quiet for a half second too long. Victoria. The scope documents are ambiguous, she said. Not because I wrote them that way intentionally, because the role was new and we hadn't fully delineated the boundary between operational strategy oversight and engineering process management. She looked at him steadily. Phil is using that ambiguity. Ryan leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, going through the situation the way he went through all situations, mapping it, identifying the actual shape of it without the noise around it. The configuration change that caused the failure, he said, the one that wasn't in the approved documentation. Someone authorized it. Yes. That authorization has a record. It should, she said. Then find it. I'm looking, she said. Dana is looking. She stopped. The changelog shows it was processed through a system account, not a named user account, which is unusual. It's unusual because it means someone used the system account deliberately to avoid leaving a named record, he said. That's one interpretation. It's the correct interpretation, he said. Someone pushed an unauthorized configuration change through a cover process, and it took the Hartwell system down. And now the person responsible for identifying who that was is being positioned as the person who failed to prevent it. He looked at her. You know what this is? She met his eyes. I know what it might be. That's not the same thing. No, she said. It's not. She held his gaze. Ryan, the board is meeting Thursday. Phil is going to formally recommend your suspension pending a review. I can fight it, but I need time to build the counter case and I need the authorization record. The word suspension landed in the room between them. He'd known it was coming for the last 3 hours. He'd felt the logic of it assembling since the moment Phil had spoken on the board call. But hearing it said out loud in a closed office by a woman who'd taken a significant professional risk on him 8 months ago landed differently than the abstract version. How long, he said. The review process is 30 days minimum. He thought about Sophie, about the school pickup schedule, about the childcare arrangement he'd built around his work hours, about what a 30-day gap in income meant even at his current salary level, where he'd only just started to build a cushion. Okay, he said. Victoria looked at him. Okay. Fight it if you can. But if you can't stop it Thursday, don't damage your own position with the board trying to. He looked at her steadily. I'll be okay for 30 days. What I need is for you to find the authorization record. I'm going to find it, she said. It was not a reassurance. It was a statement of intention. I know, he said. And he did know. He'd learned to read the difference. The story broke online Wednesday evening, 20 hours before the board meeting. Ryan saw it first on his phone, sitting in the parking lot after picking up Sophie, a business blog that covered Austin tech. Bennett Technologies faces scrutiny after major client system failure. Questions raised about CEO's relationship with controversial hire. He read it in the parking lot while Sophie ate a granola bar in the back seat and told him about something that had happened at recess. He read the headline 3 times. Then he put his phone face down on the passenger seat and finished listening to Sophie's story about recess, and he drove home, and he helped her with homework, and he made dinner, and he put her to bed. And then he sat at the kitchen table. The old card table was gone now, replaced months ago with something that had 4 even legs, and read the full article. It was carefully sourced to unnamed company insiders. It covered the system failure accurately. It described Ryan's background, no degree, no corporate history, in language that was technically neutral and contextually pointed. It described his reporting relationship with Victoria in language that was technically professional and contextually intimate. It quoted an unnamed source saying the board had serious questions about whether the director of operational strategy had the experience his title required. The comments were worse. Ryan read 4 of them before deciding that was enough. His phone had 11 messages. Marcus. Dana, who said, "Call me when you can." 3 colleagues he'd worked with on the logistics project. Victoria, whose message said only, "I'm sorry you're seeing this. I'm still working. Don't respond to anything tonight." He wrote back to her. "I know, I won't." He wrote back to Marcus. "I'm fine. Sophie's asleep. Call me tomorrow." He sat for a while in the quiet apartment that had better furniture now and a fixed heating system and the specific quality of stillness that comes after a child goes to sleep. He thought about the article, about the unnamed sources, about Cole Whitfield's careful hostility and Phil Garrett's elevator ride warning and the configuration change that someone had pushed through a system account. He didn't have proof yet, but he'd spent his whole life reading how things actually worked beneath how they were supposed to work, and the pattern he was looking at had a specific shape, and shapes had causes. He went to bed at 11 and lay there for an hour not sleeping, which he acknowledged without drama. Shab. The board meeting happened Thursday afternoon. Victoria went in with the scope documentation, with Dana's technical analysis of the failure, and with a preliminary finding from the engineering team that the configuration change was inconsistent with any authorized maintenance task on the schedule for that week. It was enough to complicate the suspension recommendation, but not enough to stop it. The board voted for a 60-day paid administrative leave pending a full operational review, softer than what Phil had proposed, harder than what Victoria had argued for. Ryan got the call from Victoria at 4:15. He was at home, had been home all day. Sophie was at school. He was sitting in the kitchen with a legal pad and 3 days' worth of notes. 60 days, she said. Paid? Yes. He exhaled slowly. Okay. I'm not done, Ryan. I know you're not. He looked at the legal pad. Can I tell you something? Go ahead. The Sunday night configuration push. Look at the Hartwell renewal file history. Specifically, the access logs for the weekend before the push. I've been going back through everything I can reach from here. He paused. The Denton performance data I flagged in March. Someone pulled that file twice on the Friday before the Sunday push. After hours. Silence. If the person who pulled that file is the same person who authorized the configuration change through the system account, he said, you have a connection between the disclosure I pushed for and the failure that discredited me. More silence. Then, how long have you been sitting on this? Since last night. I needed to check it twice before I said it. She was quiet for a moment. Ryan? Yeah. I'm going to find it, she said. Again, not reassurance, intent. I know. He set down the legal pad. Call me when you have something. After they hung up, he sat at the even-legged table and looked at the legal pad and thought about the shape of things. The rumor, the article, the suspension, Phil's careful moves, Cole's careful hostility, the unauthorized push through a system account, the file access on a Friday evening. He thought about the fact that all of this had been set in motion, ultimately because he'd done his job. He'd found the Denton issue. He'd pushed for disclosure. He'd made himself inconvenient to the deal Phil Garrett needed to close. He felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite calm, somewhere in between, a quality of focused, cold clarity that he recognized from the hardest nights of the years before this job, the nights when the math didn't work and the options were all bad, and the only available path forward was to think clearly and move deliberately and refuse to collapse. He'd survived those nights. He'd built things from them. He was going to build something from this one, too. He picked up the legal pad and started a new page. It took Dana 12 days. She called him on a Thursday morning, and the first thing she said was, I found it. He'd been waiting, not passively. He'd been mapping everything he could reach from outside the company systems, building a documented account of the timeline and his own actions and the sequence of decisions around the Hartwell disclosure. It was the kind of thing you built not because you were sure you'd need it, but because the alternative was waiting without preparation, and that had never been his approach to anything. Tell me, he said. The system account that had pushed the unauthorized configuration change had been accessed from an IP address that, with the help of the company's IT security lead, a quiet, careful woman named Priya, who had her own reasons for taking the investigation seriously, had been traced to a device registered to the Bennett Technologies network, a device that signed in twice. Once at 11:40 p.m. on a Saturday, once at 12:15 a.m. Sunday, right before the configuration push. The device belonged to Cole Whitfield. Dana laid it out in the same level, precise tone she used for everything, and Ryan listened without interrupting, going through it methodically in his mind. There's more, Dana said. Priya pulled Cole's file access logs. He accessed the Denton performance data file twice on the Friday before the push. That's the file you flagged in March. He had no documented reason to be in that file. Ryan exhaled. Does Victoria have this? She has it as of an hour ago. And Phil? A pause. Phil's access logs are under review. There's nothing definitive yet. But Cole didn't do this in a vacuum, Ryan. Nobody does something like this for their own career. No, Ryan said. They don't. He sat with it for a moment. The full confirmed shape of it. The deliberate sabotage, the cover process, the article, the board meeting, the suspension, all of it traceable back to a configuration change pushed in the middle of a Saturday night by a man who'd made a calculation that Ryan Carter was a problem worth eliminating. He felt the anger then. Properly, fully. Not the cold, focused clarity, but the actual thing, moving through him with enough force that he stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood there for a minute, just breathing. The city outside was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent to any particular person's particular situation. He let the anger run its course. He didn't do anything with it. He just let it be what it was, a legitimate response to a real thing that had been done to him. And when it had run through him, he turned away from the window and picked up his phone. He called Victoria. She answered on the second ring. "Dana called you," he said, "an hour ago." "What happens now?" "Cole's employment is being terminated today. Phil has been informed of the findings and has been asked to take a leave pending a board review of his role in the disclosure decision around Hartwell." Her voice was even, contained. "The board has been briefed. Your suspension is being rescinded effective Monday." He stood in his kitchen with his phone and looked at the even-legged table and the legal pad on it and the notes he'd been building for 12 days. "Ryan," she said. "Yeah. I need you to know. The ambiguity in the scope documents, the way your position was framed in a way that made this possible, that's on me. I should have defined it more carefully at the start. You didn't push a configuration change through a system account." "No, but I created conditions that someone could exploit." A pause. "I'm telling you, I know that." He thought about what to say. He thought about the 8 months, and the tilting table, and the storm, and the coffee, and the way she'd said I tried 4 other options first. Standing wet on his landing, he thought about Dana's coffee on his desk, about Sophie and Carlos and the volcano book, about all the ways a person's life could change direction if they were willing to walk through a door without knowing fully what was on the other side. "Okay," he said, "that's all you're going to say?" "You told me the truth. I acknowledged it." He almost smiled, though she couldn't see it. "What else do you want?" A pause. Then, quietly, "I want you to come back Monday." "I'll be there," he said. He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a long time, not celebrating, not processing dramatically, just standing in the ordinary quiet of a weekday morning in a city that had been trying to grind him down for years, in an apartment that didn't have a heating problem anymore. He looked at the legal pad. He drew a line under the last page of notes. Then he turned to a fresh page. There was still work to do. He came back on Monday the way he'd come in on his first day. A little early, the building still quiet, the lobby plants catching the morning light. Different, though. He walked differently. Not with arrogance, not with anything performative, just with the particular quality of someone who'd had something taken from them and gotten it back and understood now, more precisely than before, what it was worth. Dana was already at her desk. She looked up when he passed her office, gave him a nod that carried more weight than its brevity suggested, and went back to her screen. That was enough. That was, in its way, exactly enough. His office was as he'd left it. The legal pad was at home. He'd kept it there deliberately, the record of those 12 days separate from the building. He sat down and looked at the city through his window and gave himself approximately 4 minutes of just sitting before he opened his email and got back to work. Victoria came by at 9. She stood in his doorway in a way that was different from her usual arrivals. Slightly less certain, which for Victoria was a significant departure. "How are you?" she asked. "Fine," he said, genuinely. "The Hartwell team wants a call this week. They've been briefed on the investigation findings. They want to hear from you directly." "Set it up." She looked at him for a moment. "The board issued a formal statement yesterday clearing your name. It'll be picked up by the same outlets that ran the original story." "It won't get the same coverage," he said. "No," she said, "it won't." He shrugged, not dismissively. "That's how it works." She stayed in the doorway a beat longer than the conversation required. He noticed it. He let it sit. "I'm glad you're back," she said finally. "Me too," he said, and meant it, and let her go. The Hartwell call went better than he'd expected, and worse than he'd hoped, which was roughly how things went when a client had experienced a real failure and then learned that the failure had been deliberate sabotage by someone inside the vendor company. Hartwell's project manager, a careful, measured man named Gerald Okafor, who had been reasonable throughout the crisis, said all the right professional things and asked all the right professional questions. But there was a quality beneath the professionalism that Ryan recognized. Trust that had been stressed, not broken, not yet, but stress fractured in a way that would require time and consistent performance to heal. Ryan told him the truth about the investigation findings, about the unauthorized change in the system account and the employment terminations. He told him about the Denton fix that had been completed during the suspension period and the updated service level validation. He didn't oversell it or add cushion. He said what was accurate and let Okafor decide what to do with it. Okafor said he'd take it back to his team and follow up by end of week. He did follow up. The contract renewal, with modified terms that acknowledged the service disruption, was signed 6 weeks later. It wasn't the deal Phil had been chasing. It was smaller, with tighter performance guarantees and a structured review clause. But it was signed, and it was honest, which Ryan considered the version of the outcome that was actually sustainable. Phil Garrett's leave became permanent 2 weeks after Ryan's return. The board review had turned up enough to make the picture clear. Not criminal, nothing that would end up in a courthouse, but a consistent pattern of prioritizing deal metrics over operational reality, and a knowledge of Cole's actions that stopped just short of direct authorization, but not short enough to be credible ignorance. Phil left quietly, the way people left in circumstances like this. No announcement, a brief note to his team, a cleared desk. Ryan heard about it from Dana. He didn't say anything particular about it. There wasn't anything particular to say. Cole was gone. Phil was gone. The company adjusted the way companies adjust, filling gaps and redistributing responsibilities and moving forward, because that was what organizations did. And Ryan worked. He worked the way he'd always worked, with the focused attention of someone who understood that results were the only argument that held up over time. He rebuilt the operational oversight framework with properly delineated scope documents, the ones Victoria had acknowledged should have existed from the beginning. He brought Dana into the design process, which produced something better than either of them would have built alone. He started a structured risk identification program, quarterly reviews of the kind of low-visibility systemic issues that had generated the logistics platform problem and the Denton gap, the things that lived in the cracks between departments until they became crises. It wasn't glamorous work. It never had been. But the Hartwell account held. 2 new clients came in from referrals in the 3rd quarter. The board, at the September meeting, approved a growth allocation that would have been difficult to justify 6 months earlier when the operational foundation was still showing cracks. Ryan sat in on that board meeting for the first time. Victoria had added him to the attendees list without making a thing of it, and he'd sat near the back and listened and contributed once when a question about infrastructure scalability touched directly on his work. The board member who'd asked the question had nodded and written something down. After the meeting in the elevator, Victoria said, "You could have contributed more." "I contributed what was relevant," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You're still calibrating how much space you're allowed to take up." He thought about that for a moment. "Maybe." "You cleared a system failure that could have destroyed 2 client relationships and a board's confidence in this company. You're allowed to take up some space." He looked at the elevator doors. "I know. Do you?" He didn't answer that because answering it honestly would have required saying something about the years before this building, the years of calibrating exactly how much space you were allowed to take up, when you had no credentials and no safety net, and every mistake landed directly on a 7-year-old who needed you to be functional. You learned to make yourself efficient. You learned not to overflow. The elevator opened. He stepped out. "I'll work on it," he said. Beats. The thing between them, the thing that had been sitting in the room since the night she'd knocked on his door in the rain, had been handled the way Ryan handled most difficult things. Honestly, without drama, and at the correct time. The correct time had turned out to be a Wednesday evening in October, which was not a romantic occasion by any measure. They'd been working late, the floor mostly empty, and they'd gotten into an argument about the resourcing plan for a new client, onboarding that had escalated in the way arguments sometimes did between two people who both thought carefully and neither of whom defaulted to agreement. The argument had resolved. They'd found the right answer, which happened to be a version of both their positions, and there had been a moment of quiet afterward that had a different quality from the usual quiet. He'd said, "I need to tell you something." She'd looked at him. "The thing that people have been saying about us," he said. "The rumor. It's been wrong about what it is, but it's not entirely wrong that there's something." He held her look. "I'm telling you because I think you already know it, and I think not saying it out loud is starting to distort things." She was quiet for a moment. "You're right that I know it." "And?" "And it's complicated," she said. "You work for me. The company just went through 6 months of people questioning your presence here on exactly these grounds. The timing is, I'm not suggesting we do anything about it," he said. "I'm saying I needed to say it out loud so we're both working from the same information." She looked at him with the expression he'd been watching evolve over a year, the one that started as evaluation and had become something warmer and more uncertain, which on Victoria's face was a significant development. "Okay," she said, "we're both working from the same information." "Good," he said. They went back to their respective desks. He drove home and picked up Sophie from the neighbor who'd watched her and heated up leftovers, and listened to a very long account of something that had happened in the lunch line. He went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept adequately. Nothing changed, and everything was slightly different, which was exactly the outcome he'd been going for. The decision came to him in pieces, the way decisions that actually change your life usually do. Not a single moment of revelation, but an accumulating weight that eventually tipped. The first piece was a conversation with a small contractor in East Austin, a man named Darnell, who ran a community water access project serving a cluster of underserved neighborhoods that the city's main infrastructure plan had deprioritized for years. Darnell had contacted Bennett Technologies about their water management software, gone through the standard sales process, and been quoted a licensing cost that was technically fair by enterprise pricing standards and practically impossible for a nonprofit infrastructure project operating on grant funding. Ryan had seen the quote in the system and pulled Darnell's file and looked at the project and spent an evening reading about what it was actually doing. He'd taken it to the pricing team and argued for a modified rate, which they'd resisted because modified rates for small nonprofits didn't fit the enterprise model. He'd escalated it to Victoria, who'd approved a one-time exception. One-time exception. That phrase had sat with him. The second piece was a conversation with Dana in November, over bad coffee from the third-floor machine, about the company's strategic roadmap. Bennett Technologies was building toward acquisition. That was the direction the board was pointing, had been pointing for over a year. A larger player, probably in the infrastructure tech space, buying the platform and the client base and the team. It was a legitimate business outcome. It was what the investors had been pointing toward from the beginning. Ryan had known this in abstract terms for months. The November conversation made it concrete, within 2 years probably. The structure of the company he'd helped fix and build was aimed at a sale. "Does that bother you?" Dana had asked. He'd thought about it genuinely. "Not the sale itself," he said. "What happens after the sale bothers me a little." "The acquirer reshuffles," she said. "Standard." "The Darnell project in East Austin doesn't survive a reshuffling," he said. "The Hartwell modifications don't survive a reshuffling. The way we've been building the client relationships, the honest version, that gets replaced with whatever the acquirer's model is." Dana had looked at him over her cup. "You've been thinking about this a while." "A little while," he said. The third piece was Sophie. She was 8 now, had been 8 since July, and she had moved through her first year of his new life with the adaptive practicality of a child who trusted that the adults around her were handling things. She'd visited the office once, on a Saturday when Ryan had gone in for a few hours and brought her because the childcare had fallen through. She'd sat at his desk with a book and eaten the snacks he'd brought for her and looked around the office with the frank assessment she applied to everything. "Do you like it here?" she'd asked. He'd looked around his office, the window, the city, the evidence folder on his computer desktop, the revised scope documents in a binder on his shelf. "I do," he said. "It's been good." "But?" she said. He'd looked at her. "What makes you think there's a but?" You said it like there's a but, she said. He'd laughed. You're too perceptive. What's perceptive? It means you notice things other people miss. She'd thought about this with the seriousness she brought to compliments. Carlos is perceptive too, she said. He noticed the heating was fixed before you told me. Ryan had sat in the chair across from his own desk, the visitor's chair, and looked at his daughter and thought about what he was actually building here. What legacy meant, not in an abstract, aspirational sense, but in the specific concrete sense of what you left behind and what you built and whether it was yours. He was good at his job. He'd proven that through the failure and the sabotage and the suspension and everything that had come after. He'd helped build something real inside this company. But it wasn't his. The foundation wasn't his. The direction wasn't his. He was essential to a machine that was running toward an outcome he hadn't chosen and couldn't redirect. He thought about Darnell's water project, about the communities the enterprise model treated as exceptions, about the version of infrastructure technology that could exist if it were built from the ground up around the actual problems people had, instead of the price points enterprise clients could pay. He started drafting, not a business plan, not yet, just a legal pad's worth of thinking on nights after Sophie went to sleep. The kind of thinking that didn't have a clear destination yet, but had a direction. Mossy. He told Victoria in December. He'd asked her to lunch, which was unusual enough that she'd looked at him when he asked with the expression of someone filing a note. They went to a restaurant 2 blocks from the office. Not somewhere fancy, just somewhere they could talk without the building around them. He waited until they'd ordered, and then he told her. I'm going to leave, he said. Not immediately. I want to give you proper time to transition the work, but I've decided. She was very still for a moment. Tell me why, she said. He told her about Darnell's project and the one-time exception, about the acquisition trajectory and what he thought it meant for the work that had actually mattered to him, about the version of a company he'd been sketching out on legal pads, one that built infrastructure technology specifically for the underserved gap in the market, the municipalities and community organizations in mid-tier cities that the enterprise model consistently treated as too small to matter. She listened without interrupting. This was one of the things he'd come to value most about her. She gave ideas the space to be fully stated before she engaged with them. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You could do this from inside Bennett, she said. We could create a division that reports to a board aimed at an acquisition, he said, that gets evaluated by enterprise metrics, that gets cut in a reshuffling. He shook his head. It needs to be built as the thing itself, not as an appendage to something else. You know that. She looked at him. I know that, she said quietly. The company's in good shape, he said. Better shape than when I got here. Dana is... He paused. Dana is actually better positioned to do what I do than she was a year ago, partly because we work together. The operational framework is documented and functioning. This is not me leaving you with a crisis. I know it isn't, she said. I'm telling you the truth about my reasons. I know you are. She looked at her water glass. I've always known you would leave eventually. I think I knew it before you did. He looked at her. What do you mean? The way you thought about the work, she said. You were never fully mine. You were always thinking about the version of it that was yours. She said it without accusation, just with the precision she brought to things that were true. I hired you knowing that. I don't regret it. He held her look for a moment. There was something in the conversation that they were both navigating around, the thing that had been said out loud in October and neither of them had acted on because the moment hadn't been right. Victoria, he said. I know, she said. This changes the professional context. It does, she said. So, she looked at him with the expression that had evolved over 14 months from evaluation into something much less certain and much more honest. So when you've built something, when it's real and it's standing on its own, we talk again. That could be years, he said. I know what years look like, she said. I built this company. He nodded once. Okay. They ate lunch and talked about the transition plan and the timeline, and he told her he was thinking 6 months, which would take him through the spring and give Dana and the team time to absorb the operational framework fully. She agreed to 6 months. She was businesslike about it, which he respected, and once, When he was talking through the handover structure, she smiled at something he said, a real smile, not the professional version, and looked briefly like someone who was proud of a thing even while letting it go. He told Sophie that night. Not everything. The version a 9-year-old needed, which was he was going to leave his job and start his own company. It would be harder for a while. They'd be okay. Sophie listened with the focused expression she wore when processing important information. What kind of company? She asked. Infrastructure technology, for communities that bigger companies ignore. She turned this over. Like the water project you told me about? He looked at her. Exactly like that. She was quiet for a moment. Then, can I tell Carlos? Sure. She picked up the penguin from the arm of the couch and held him up and said, in a serious tone, Daddy's starting a company. Then she held him to her ear as if listening. She nodded. He says that's a good idea. Ryan looked at his daughter and the stuffed penguin that had been through approximately as much as either of them. Carlos has good instincts, he said. I know, she said. That's why I keep him. He went to bed that night with the legal pad on the nightstand and a list that was longer than any previous list, full of things he didn't know how to do yet, and would have to learn and would likely get wrong at least twice before he got them right. He looked at it for a while, not with dread, but with the particular clear-eyed attention he gave to real problems. Then he turned off the light. In the morning, there would be a conversation with Victoria about transition timelines and a call with Marcus, who had been hearing Ryan's sketches and ideas for weeks, and had already said once, carefully, that he might know some people worth talking to. There would be Sophie's school pickup at 3:15 and Fraction's homework and the nightly negotiation over bedtime. There would be 1,000 things he hadn't figured out yet. He'd always worked better that way, with the actual problem in front of him, no safety net, no version of the outcome guaranteed. He closed his eyes. Outside, Austin kept going. The traffic and the lights and the ordinary machinery of a city that had been grinding people down and building them up since long before Ryan Carter, and long after, indifferent and relentless and full, if you looked carefully enough, of exactly the kinds of problems that needed someone willing to see them clearly. He was, it turned out, very good at that. The first year of Groundwork Technologies was, by most practical measures, a controlled disaster. Not catastrophic, not the kind of failure that ends things, but the kind that grinds, steady, relentless, full of small humiliations and larger miscalculations and the specific exhaustion of a person who has taken on more than they knew how to carry and is learning the weight of it in real time. Ryan had known it would be hard. He'd told himself it would be hard. That knowledge turned out to be insufficient preparation for the actual experience of hard, which had a texture and a duration that knowing about it in advance didn't soften much. He'd left Bennett Technologies in June, a proper handover, 6 months exactly as he'd promised. Dana had taken over the operational oversight framework with the quiet competence he'd expected from her. On his last day, she'd come to his office with 2 cups of coffee, same as the first time, same terrible third-floor machine, and they'd sat and talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of acknowledgement of everything. You're going to make mistakes you couldn't have made here, she said near the end. I know. That's not a warning, that's just true. She looked at her cup. The ones you make on your own teach you differently than the ones you make inside someone else's structure. He thought about that a lot in the months that followed. Groundwork Technologies started in a 2-room office in East Austin that Ryan rented for less than he'd paid for his first apartment, which was a fact that he found either encouraging or alarming depending on the day. He had 2 employees, a young engineer named Tomas, who'd come from a municipal water authority and had spent 3 years watching infrastructure software fail the communities it was supposed to serve, and a woman named Keisha who handled operations and finance and had a background in nonprofit administration that turned out to be more relevant than Ryan had anticipated. Marcus had come through with introductions, as he'd cautiously suggested he might. 2 early investors, not large commitments, nothing that removed the financial pressure, but enough to establish that the concept was fundable. Ryan had pitched them with a legal pad and a laptop, and the specific quality of conviction that comes from someone describing a problem they've watched personally for years, rather than one they read about in a market research report. The early clients were small, Exactly the kind of organizations Bennett Technologies had treated as exceptions: a water management cooperative in San Antonio, a traffic coordination project in a mid-sized New Mexico City that had been trying to modernize its infrastructure with a municipal budget that wouldn't have covered a single enterprise license. Darnell's project in East Austin, which finally got software built around what it actually needed rather than what the enterprise model offered. Working with those clients was different from anything Ryan had done before. The problems were real in a way that corporate infrastructure problems were real but adjacent to, not abstract service-level metrics, but actual water access for actual neighborhoods, actual traffic safety for actual intersections where actual people drove their actual children to actual schools. When something worked, you felt it differently. When something failed, you felt that differently too. He failed regularly in the first year. Missed a technical specification on the San Antonio project that cost 3 weeks of rework. Underpriced the New Mexico contract by a margin that meant he was paying Tomas and Keisha on time and paying himself late for 4 consecutive months. Made a hiring decision in October that he reversed in December, which was expensive and uncomfortable, and taught him something specific about the difference between a person's capability and a person's fit for a particular kind of work. Sophie watched all of this with the alert attention of a child who understood more than she was given credit for. She was 9, then 10. She stopped asking if things were okay and started asking specific questions. Are we behind on rent? What happened with the New Mexico project? Why do you look like that? He answered her honestly, in language calibrated to what she could use without carrying more weight than a child should carry. She was practical about it in a way that sometimes made his chest hurt, because the practicality came from somewhere. From years of watching her father navigate tight margins with deliberate calm and absorbing that as the normal shape of things. He called Victoria occasionally. Not regularly, not on any schedule, just when something happened that he wanted to think through out loud with someone who understood both the operational reality and the stakes, and whose judgment he trusted in the specific way you trust the judgment of someone who has watched you work under pressure and knows what your actual thinking looks like. She never pushed. She asked questions, offered perspective when he asked for it, and held a quality of steady attention on the other end of the line that he found, in the harder months, genuinely sustaining. She'd left the CEO position at Bennett Technologies in the fall, 18 months after his departure. A planned transition, a new CEO brought in from outside, Victoria moving to a board advisory role as the acquisition process she'd been building toward began in earnest. He heard about it from Marcus before he heard from her, which told him something about how she was handling it. He called her that evening. "I heard," he said. "I figured you would." A pause. "It's the right move. The company is positioned correctly for the acquisition, and the new CEO is better suited for that phase than I am. How do you feel about it?" A longer pause. "Like someone who built a thing and is now watching it become something else," she said. "Which is what you do when you build a thing. You don't own it forever. It goes where it goes." He thought about the tilting table, about the version of his life that had existed before a storm and a knock on a door. "Victoria," he said. "I know," she said. And she did know. He could hear it. "It's been 2 years," he said. "Almost. The company is standing. It's not thriving yet, but it's standing." "I know that too," she said. "So," she laughed. A small, genuine sound that he'd heard rarely enough that it still registered as something significant. "So," she said. She came to Austin in March, not for a meeting or a board obligation, but just to come, which was something she hadn't done before. She didn't announce it dramatically. She texted him 3 days ahead. "I'm going to be in Austin the week of the 15th, if you have time." He texted back, "I have time." She stayed in a hotel because that was the right decision for approximately a dozen reasons, and neither of them discussed it. But she had dinner at his apartment. His apartment now was a proper 2-bedroom. Sophie had her own room and he had a real bed, and there was a dining table that didn't tilt. And Sophie, who was 10 and had heard Ryan mention Victoria enough times to have constructed a fairly accurate internal model of who she was, received her with the frank, evaluative attention she gave everything important. "You're the one from the storm," Sophie said at the table. Victoria looked at Ryan. He offered nothing. That's one way to put it, Victoria said. Daddy said you knocked on the door in the rain and Carlos liked you. Sophie picked up her fork. I don't always remember things from when I was 7, but I remember that. Carlos has good instincts, Victoria said. Sophie looked at her steadily. That's what Daddy says. Then we agree, Victoria said. Something shifted in Sophie's face, the micro-adjustment of a child recalibrating an assessment. She went back to her dinner, and the conversation moved, and by the time they'd finished eating, Sophie was telling Victoria about a science project involving soil erosion with the detailed enthusiasm she brought to things that had genuinely captured her attention. Victoria listened with the same quality of attention she gave everything, real, focused, not performed, and asked questions that were specific enough to confirm she was actually following. After Sophie went to bed, Ryan and Victoria sat at the table with the remainder of a bottle of wine and the specific quiet of two people who had arrived after a long and indirect route, at a moment they'd both been moving toward without rushing it. She's remarkable, Victoria said. I know. He turned his glass. She gets the best of me and then the parts that came from somewhere else. What parts came from somewhere else? The storytelling, the way she holds a room. Her mother was good at that. He said it without residual pain. Just as a fact, the way you could describe someone accurately without being owned by the history. Sophie didn't get that from me. She got the other things from you, Victoria said. The way she looks at a problem, the way she listens before she responds. She held his look. Those aren't small things. He looked at her across the table, the woman who had stood wet on his landing, and said, I tried 4 other options first and meant it as information rather than apology, who had hired him on an unconventional instinct and defended that instinct under pressure, who had told him the truth about the scope document ambiguity when she could have let it be implicit, who had said, when you've built something, we talk again, and then waited, without demanding, for that to become true. I want to talk about us, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm here. He looked at his glass. I need you to know. This isn't because the company is doing well enough that I feel secure. I was going to have this conversation regardless. The timing is what it is because it took me this long to feel like I was doing it from the right place. What's the right place? Not need, he said. Not gratitude. Not the version of this where I'm grateful to you for changing my life. And that gratitude looks like love because it's the biggest feeling I have. She held his look without blinking. I know who you are, he said. I've watched you work under pressure for over a year. I've watched you make decisions, good ones and wrong ones. I know the version of you that isn't performing anything for anyone. That's the version I'm talking about. He set down his glass. That's the version I want. She was quiet for a moment. The apartment was still, the city outside doing its late-night hum. I'm not easy, she said. I'm aware. I'm opinionated about things that don't always matter. I work too much. I find most social situations tolerable rather than enjoyable. I have specific ideas about how a kitchen should be organized, and I will reorganize yours within 6 months if we spend any real time together. The kitchen could use reorganization, he said. She almost smiled. I'm being serious. So am I. He leaned forward slightly. Victoria, I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for real. She looked at him for a long moment, the evaluating look, the one that had been the first thing he'd known about her, standing on his landing with rain in her hair. But underneath it now was the other thing, the thing that had been building for 2.5 years in the specific way that real things build, slowly, through friction and honesty, and the accumulation of 1,000 small moments of choosing to be truthful with each other rather than convenient. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. It wasn't a declaration or a promise or a dramatic turning point. It was two people who had looked at the same thing from a distance for long enough and finally stopped pretending they hadn't. The next 3 years were not simple. They were, in their way, the most demanding years Ryan had lived, which was a significant statement given the competition. Groundwork technologies grew, but not cleanly. It grew the way things grow when they're built on real problems instead of market projections, unevenly, with setbacks that were frustrating precisely because you'd worked too hard to earn setbacks, with breakthroughs that sometimes came from unexpected directions and sometimes came from exactly the direction you'd been pushing for 18 months and refused to abandon. The San Antonio Water Cooperative expanded its contract after the first year's work, demonstrated measurable improvements in distribution efficiency that their engineering team could point to specifically and quantitatively. That expansion brought 2 referrals, and those referrals brought a conversation with a regional infrastructure planning body in Texas that led, after 8 months of negotiation that Ryan handled personally and imperfectly and eventually correctly, to a statewide pilot program. The pilot program was the thing that changed the company's scale. Not overnight. Nothing happened overnight, and Ryan had learned enough by then to be suspicious of anything that did. But over 18 months, the pilot produced results that were specific and documented and hard to argue with, and the conversation around Groundwork Technologies changed from interesting small company doing niche work to company with a model worth scaling. Tomas built the engineering team from 2 to 14, and the process of doing that taught Ryan things about organizational design that no amount of prior operational strategy work had fully prepared him for. He got it wrong 3 times in ways that cost the company real money and real talent. He got it right enough times to maintain forward momentum, and the times he got it wrong he acknowledged directly and corrected as fast as he could. Keisha became COO in the 2nd year, a title change that acknowledged what she'd been doing for 12 months already. She was better at her job than Ryan was at hers, which he'd noticed early and acted on rather than feeling threatened by, which was one of the better decisions he made in the company's 2nd year. Victoria joined the company's advisory board in the 3rd year. It had been her suggestion, not his, offered one evening in the matter-of-fact tone she used for things she'd already thought through fully. "I have infrastructure sector knowledge and board experience that would be useful to you. I should formalize it." He'd looked at her. "You sure you want that relationship with this company?" "I want that relationship with what you're building," she said. "The company structure is the vehicle. I can navigate the vehicle." She'd been right. She was useful in ways that were specific and practical and grounded in real experience, and she was clear about where the boundary was between her advisory role and his operational authority, which was a boundary she respected and that he never had to defend. The personal thing and the professional adjacency coexisted awkwardly at first, and then less awkwardly, and eventually with the easy fluency of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms and knew which conversations belonged where. She moved to Austin in the 3rd year. He helped her find an apartment 12 minutes from his. Sophie, who was 13 by then and had developed both her father's directness and her own independent judgment about people, gave Victoria a measured, watchful acceptance that gradually, over months, became something warmer and less guarded. It didn't happen fast. It wasn't supposed to. Sophie had a mother in Dallas who she saw regularly and who was part of her life, and Victoria was careful never to position herself as anything that role didn't leave room for. She occupied the space that was available, present, reliable, interested in Sophie's actual life rather than a performed version of it, and let time do the rest. The moment Ryan marked privately as the turning point was small. Sophie was 13, doing a school project on urban infrastructure, a topic she'd chosen herself, which he'd noticed and not commented on. She'd asked Victoria a question about municipal water systems one Sunday afternoon, and Victoria had spent 45 minutes going through it with her, genuinely engaged, pulling up data on her laptop, asking Sophie questions back that made Sophie think harder. At the end of it, Sophie had said, with the careful deliberateness of a teenager offering something significant, "You're actually good at explaining things." Victoria had looked at her. "Thank you. That's not something I usually hear. You explain to people like they can understand, not like you're doing them a favor." Ryan had been in the kitchen within earshot and had stayed very still. "I learned that from someone," Victoria said, quietly. Sophie had looked toward the kitchen, then back at Victoria. Something moved through her face that Ryan couldn't fully read from the kitchen doorway, and she turned back to her project, but she'd let Victoria sit beside her for the rest of the afternoon. The acquisition conversation came in the 4th year, from a direction Ryan hadn't anticipated. It wasn't a hostile approach, or a strategic buyout from a competitor. It was an approach from a national infrastructure investment consortium, a body that operated at the intersection of public and private infrastructure funding, with a mandate that was genuinely aligned with what Groundwork was doing. They weren't trying to buy the model in order to scale it up the enterprise ladder. They were trying to partner with it to deploy it more broadly. Ryan spent 3 months evaluating it. He brought it to the advisory board, including Victoria. He brought it to Tomas and Keisha. He talked to the clients, Darnell, the San Antonio Cooperative, the regional bodies that had come on board through the pilot. He was direct with them about what was being proposed and what the risks were. Most of them said a version of the same thing. Depends on how you structure the terms. He structured the terms carefully, which took another 4 months and several iterations that nearly collapsed the negotiation twice. The deal that eventually closed preserved Groundwork's operational independence, protected the pricing structure that made the work accessible to the clients it had been built for, and included a governance mechanism that gave the existing client base a voice in product decisions. It was not a perfect deal. No deal was. There were concessions he'd made that he wasn't entirely comfortable with, and that he acknowledged internally with the honesty he tried to apply to his own decisions. But it was a deal he could stand behind, and it gave the company the capital to scale in ways the bootstrapped model never could have. The day it closed, Ryan sat in his office, a real office now, in a building Groundwork owned, 3 floors in East Austin with a rooftop that looked out over the city, and allowed himself the specific indulgence of thinking about the card table. The tilting one, the stack of bills, face down, the 4:30 warehouse alarm, the delivery routes on Tuesday evenings, the way the math hadn't worked and had never worked, and somehow he'd gotten through it anyway, night after night, because what else do you do when someone is counting on you? He thought about all of that for a few minutes. Then he called Sophie. She was in her first year of college, environmental engineering, which had surprised no one who'd known her since the Volcano book. She'd chosen a school in Austin deliberately, which she'd told him was for the program, and which he understood was also partly something else, and he'd accepted both reasons without pushing. "Hey," she said. "How'd it close?" "Good," he said. "The structure held." "The governance piece?" "Intact." He looked out his window. "Darnell's project stays protected." She was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. And he could hear in the word everything she didn't elaborate on. The years of watching him do the work, the East Austin water project she'd heard him talk about since she was 9, the through line she'd followed from the tilting table to this office window. "I'm proud of you, Daddy," she said, straightforwardly. No hedging. He held the phone and looked at the city. "That means a lot," he said. "More than most things." After he hung up, he sat for a while. Then he texted Victoria. "It closed. Come by the office when you're done." She was there in an hour. She came to his office and sat across from him, and they talked through the details, the parts that had worked, and the parts that had been imperfect, and the parts that were still unresolved. And at some point, the conversation shifted from business to something else, the way it always did eventually when the business part was done. "Where are we?" she said. Not dramatically, just the question. He looked at her. "I think you know where we are." "I want to hear you say it." "I want to build the rest of it with you," he said. "Not just the company, the actual rest of it." He held her look. "I know what I'm asking. I know you. I know what it costs and what it's worth, and I'm asking." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Austin was doing the late afternoon thing, the light changing, the city shifting into the evening version of itself. The building hummed with the ordinary machinery of people still working. "You know I'm going to reorganize the kitchen," she said. "You already have," he said. "The spice rack." She almost laughed. That was an improvement. "It was," he admitted. She looked at him with the expression he'd been watching evolve since a storm-lit landing 3.5 years ago. From evaluation to something undone, from controlled to genuinely uncertain, and now to something that had found its ground. Not comfortable in a soft way, steady in a real way. "Yes," she said. "Set." They married the following spring. Not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted large. They'd talked about it once and arrived at the same answer from different directions, which Ryan had come to understand was usually what happened when two people were genuinely aligned on something rather than performing alignment. Small. The people who had actually been there for the actual version of the story. Marcus, who had sent that text on a stormy October night without knowing what it would start, stood in the front row with the expression of a man who felt entitled to some credit and was too gracious to claim it. Dana Reyes came from Chicago, where she'd taken a position after the Bennett acquisition closed and built something significant in her own right. She and Ryan had stayed in the specific ongoing contact of two people who'd learned to trust each other's judgment under pressure and didn't let that go. She wore a dark blue dress and shook Ryan's hand and said, in the direct tone she used for everything, "You both did this right." He thought about that later, the way she'd said it. You both did this right. Not easily, not without damage, not without the years of carefully choosing the honest version of things over the convenient one, but right. Darnell came, which Ryan hadn't expected. He arrived with two members of his cooperative board and stood near the back with the quiet dignity of someone who understood they were part of something larger than the event. He'd told Ryan once that the work Groundwork had done for his project had changed what was possible for the communities he served. Not fixed everything, not made it perfect, but changed the actual available options. Ryan had carried that sentence for 2 years as the closest thing to a mission statement the company had. Sophie walked beside her father before the ceremony in the garden of the venue they'd chosen. Small, outdoor, Austin in April, with the temperature just right and the light the way Texas light sometimes was in spring, clear and particular. She was 19 and tall and had her mother's way of holding a room and her father's way of looking at it. "You okay?" she asked him. "Yeah," he said. "You?" She thought about it, which he appreciated. She didn't give reflexive answers, hadn't since she was 8. "I think so," she said. "It's a lot, but the good kind." He nodded. "She's good for you," Sophie said. Not with the concession of someone granting permission, just with the assessment of someone who had watched two people over years and formed a considered opinion. Not because she does things for you, because she makes you less, the thing where you hold too much alone. He looked at his daughter. "When did you get this perceptive?" "You told me I was perceptive when I was 9, she said. "I've been working on it." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised you. And then Sophie put her arm through his and they walked toward where Victoria was waiting. And the afternoon held them all in its ordinary specific light. And the story that had started on a stormy night with a knock on a door arrived, in this moment, at something whole. Not finished, not perfect. Nothing real was ever finished or perfect. The company would face new problems in the next quarter. Sophie would encounter things in her life that he couldn't fix. Victoria would reorganize something in the kitchen that didn't need reorganizing, and he would say something about it. And they'd have an argument that would resolve because that was what they did with arguments. Resolved them, imperfectly, honestly, and kept going. Carlos the Penguin was on a shelf in Sophie's apartment now, retired from active duty, still holding in his stuffed fabric face the particular dignity of an object that has been through things. Sophie had taken him to college with the same matter-of-fact certainty with which she'd first extended him to a wet stranger on a couch in a small apartment. Because some things you carry forward, not out of sentimentality, but because they mean something real, and real things deserve to be kept. There is something worth saying about the way this story actually works. Not the romance of it, not the success arc, but the mechanism underneath. Ryan Carter did not succeed because he got lucky. He got a door, a single knock in the rain, a stranger's generosity, a moment of someone seeing something in him. But the country is full of people who get doors and can't walk through them, because walking through a door toward something uncertain requires a specific kind of willingness to be exposed, to be seen without credentials or protection, to make your case with nothing but the quality of your thinking and the consistency of your character. What Ryan had, what he'd built across years of hard margins and tight math, and the daily obligation of a child depending on him, was not cleverness or ambition in the conventional sense. It was the ability to see things as they actually were, not as they were supposed to be. To look at a system and find the gap between the story the system told about itself and the reality the system was actually producing. To do this without bitterness, without the distortion of ego or fear, and then to do something about it. That ability wasn't the product of education or privilege or fortunate circumstance. It was the product of necessity applied over time, of years spent keeping things running on not enough, of building systems from whatever was available, of learning that the actual version of things was always more useful to understand than the official version. The people who dismissed him, who read his background and made their calculation about what he was worth, were not stupid. They were running a rational model based on the available signals. The problem was that the available signals were incomplete, and they decided not to look further. The people who saw further, Victoria, Dana, eventually Darnell, and the clients who gave him their real problems to solve, were not doing something extraordinary. They were just asking a different question, not what does this person's background tell me he's capable of, but what does the actual evidence of his thinking tell me he's capable of? That distinction sounds small. It is not small. It is the difference between a system that perpetuates its own assumptions and a system that can correct itself. Victoria had her own version of this lesson, which she'd had to learn differently. She'd built her company from intelligence and discipline and the force of a particular kind of will that could drive a company through its growth years but couldn't, by itself, see the gaps that her own confidence created. What Ryan had given her, in that first conversation, across the months of professional friction, across everything, was a mirror for the actual version of things. She'd had to be willing to look at it. Most powerful people are not willing. Victoria was, and that willingness was not incidental to who she was. It was the core of it, the thing that made the intelligence and the discipline mean something more than just success. Sophie would grow up with both of them as models of something that didn't have a clean name. Not success exactly. Not resilience, which had become a word that people used to tell struggling people that the difficulty was their opportunity. Something quieter and more durable. The willingness to do the actual work, to see the actual problem, to tell the actual truth, and to keep going when it was hard in the specific, unglamorous way that things are hard when they're real. She'd carry that forward into her own work, her own problems, her own version of a door in the rain. She'd get it wrong sometimes. She'd get it right enough times to matter. And she'd have, in the architecture of her earliest years, the evidence that it was possible. That a person starting from nothing in particular, with no guarantee and no safety net, and nothing but a willingness to see clearly and work honestly, could build something that lasted. That is not a small thing to leave a child. It is, in the end, the most important thing. Pochab. Years after the storm that first brought them together, on a spring evening in Austin with the light doing the thing it sometimes did at that hour, sitting gold and specific on everything, making ordinary objects look briefly significant, Ryan Carter stood in the garden of a small venue with his wife beside him and his daughter across the grass, and his oldest friend eating something from the buffet table with the focused satisfaction of a man who felt he'd contributed materially to the outcome. Victoria's hand was in his. She was looking at something across the garden. Darnell talking to Sophie, an animated conversation about soil and water and the engineering of things that had gone wrong and been made right. She was watching with the expression Ryan had learned to read as hers. Not quite a smile, not fully contained, something in between that was the true register of how she felt about something. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. That it took a long time, she said, and that it was worth it. He looked at the garden, at the people in it who had been, in their various ways, part of the story, who had pushed or supported or challenged or stood steady in the specific ways the story had required. "Yeah," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment, not dramatically, not with any performance. Just briefly, the way people do when they're standing next to the right person in the right place at the right time and they know it. Then she straightened up and looked at the buffet table where Marcus had now been joined by Tomas and appeared to be telling a story that required significant hand gestures. "Your friend is going to be unbearable about this for years," she said. "He's already unbearable about it," Ryan said. "It's going to get worse." "I'm aware." He turned to look at her. "You okay with that?" She looked back at him, the evaluating look, the real one, the one that had been the beginning of everything. "I'm okay with all of it," she said. And the evening held them there, in the ordinary particular light of a city that had been grinding people down and building them up since long before either of them, the way cities do, indifferent and relentless and full, always, of the kinds of problems that needed someone willing to see them clearly. Ryan Carter had always been very good at that. He'd finally found the right place to use it.